is introduce our panelists, how this goes, and then go from there. So how to teach African-American history. States, school districts, and individual teachers all want to know how to teach African-American history as part of the broader narrative of the character of the American nation, American individuals' capacity to pursue happiness, and the successful work of generations of Americans to apply America's ideals of liberty to all Americans. How to teach of Benjamin Banneker, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., and Clarence Thomas as exemplary Americans. The panelists of this webinar will discuss how state standards, lesson plans, and individual scholars can work together to promote the proper teaching of African-American history. Now, very briefly, our three panelists, who are all, how should I put this, too distinguished to be able to list all their accomplishments concisely, are William Allen, Emeritus Dean and Professor at Michigan State University, and I will mention, who had a distinct role in Florida's new African-American history strand in its social studies standards. Benjamin Jones, former Secretary of Education for South Dakota and Director of South Dakota State Historical Society, and a member of the commission that was helping to craft South Dakota's social studies standards as a whole. And then Ian Rowe, a senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute and writer for the 1776 Unites campaign, and particularly where the interest here is 1776 Unites individual lesson plans on African-American history. Now, this is going to be 12 to 14 minutes each of, conversational talk by each of the three panelists, followed by a question and answer moderated discussion, prompted by you, the audience, who will put all your questions into, I will say, choose chat or question and answer, whichever button you prefer, preferable if you choose one or the other, but I will look at both. I will choose questions from there based upon whatever seems like would be interesting to promote a conversation, not chronological order. I try to answer them all. If your questions aren't answered, don't worry. Send email to me, randall@nas.org, and I'll be delighted to forward your questions to the panelists so they have the option of answering. Also, if you have to leave partway through, or if you want to talk about this to anybody, this will be recorded and on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. So you will be able to recite, forward, look, continue if you have to get off suddenly. Having said all that, Professor Allen, may I ask if you'd be kind enough to speak first?
Thank you very much. And let me first simply say I appreciate that you are holding this forum and giving us the opportunity to participate in a conversation that has already demonstrated that it has broad significance today in the United States. The question that is posed of African-American history goes to the very heart of what it is we think of ourselves as a nation. And so the first observation I want to make is that this is not the history of Black people, it's the history of the United States. And one doesn't begin to approach that topic of African-American history properly unless one understands it as a component element of the history of the United States. And I'll try to illustrate that for you. What we need to understand is that we're talking about the ways in which people navigate the circumstances of life, is the way I would put it. And that is, of course, to say how they make choices in the circumstances that they face. And those choices have to be understood as the choices of the persons, the individuals themselves. It is a reflection of their agency. Now, what's important about that is to recognize that during the period of slavery in the United States, agency was not erased. Agency still was present. And we know that for several reasons that are quite significant. What we have to do is to say that we first observe that Africans were not brought into the United States through immigration. They were brought as slaves. No free people were brought from Africa. Slaves were brought from Africa, brought to be enslaved here. Initially, of course, they were brought under differing circumstances of servitude, indentured servitude, first of all, and for 20 or so years, only indentured servitude. But that evolutionary process of developing perpetual lifelong slavery based on race began by the 1640s and continued to develop thereafter. So that what we had was a kind of foot race between the choice for freedom and the imposition of slavery. And it is important to observe that for the Africans who came into North America, the choice for freedom was always evident. And I speak now, of course, about the many runaways, but long before that, there was quite obviously evidence of a choice for freedom, and particularly in the context of the Revolutionary War, where in George Washington's army, 10% of the soldiers were free Black men. That's an extraordinary percentage in terms of the so-called population representation. But those Black soldiers, starting with Crispus Attucks and proceeding from there through the Marbleheads and others, were making a choice for freedom. Freedom personally and freedom for the United States. That reflects what I call the abolition dynamic, a dynamic that was present from 1609, that was reflected not in an African, because there were no Africans in 1609, but in a man named Stephen Hopkins, who was there at Jamestown in Virginia, and who subsequently actually returned on the Mayflower as one of the Pilgrims, and whose story, in a way, highlights the continuing tension in the development of the United States between the principle of abolition and the principles of freedom. That's why I call it a kind of foot race. And there were certainly periods of time when slavery seemed to have the ascendance in that foot race. But eventually, as we know, freedom prevailed. And this is signified, of course, by the huge numbers of free Blacks and runaway slaves who participated as soldiers in the army of the Union in the Civil War. So that looking at the large scale, the general geopolitical environment, we are able to make a conclusion that a proper history of the United States, a history which reflects the true ground tone of the United States, is a history of freedom, not the history of slavery. And so what we're facing today are the efforts by some people to define the United States in terms of the history of slavery, excluding the history of freedom. And that is why this has become a dilemma for us. Because if we marginalize the importance of freedom in the development of the United States, we, of course, disqualify the United States as a bearer of freedom and as a culture and a political society that should be inspiring and should appeal to human beings who are engaged in defending the fundamental principles of humanity itself, who are exercising the natural rights with which they are endowed. This choice for freedom is a personal choice, but it is a personal choice that attains political expression when people unite in its pursuit, as those soldiers in the Revolutionary Army united with their brothers to secure the liberty of the United States. It's also a personal choice, as is reflected in the ways in which they advance within the United States. Very soon after the Declaration of Independence, we had motions towards abolishing slavery in Massachusetts. They were led by, in many ways and by many people, but very notably by Prince Hall. Prince Hall, who is the founder of the Prince Hall Masons, sent petitions in early 1777, using the language of the Declaration, to the General Court of Massachusetts, asking for the abolition of slavery, and continued to repeat those among other people until by 1783, they had accomplished their goal in terms of the law. It took some years after that for it to work its way through the system, but the point was it was moving in a certain direction. It's the same kind of personal choice that was also a choice for this country that we see reflected in Richard Allen, founder of the AME Church, who in his writings, not just to church members, but to slaveholders, to non-slave holding whites, and to free blacks. And he wrote a series of all such messages, all proclaiming the same thing, the choice for freedom as intrinsic to the recognition and respect for human rights. For the fundamental reality is that slavery was never lawful in the proper sense, which is to say, lawful in the light of nature. It was a violation of the very nature of what it means to be a human being, as the Declaration of Independence appropriately signifies. So through that, and through the efforts of Benjamin Banneker, whose correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, when Thomas Jefferson served as Secretary of State, we see constantly Africans in the United States urging the country as a whole to recognize and acknowledge the importance of the principles of 1776 of the Declaration of Independence, and also claiming them for themselves, claiming the opportunity to make decisions for themselves. Let me make this rather prosaic, if I might. In 1962, the state of Florida reached a historical turning point in some respect. It had reached many such historical turning points, but this was only relevant because of my own personal experience. It was in 1962 that the University of Florida and its undergraduate classes was integrated. The new class admitted that year for the first time included Black students. As it turned out, I was one of the students admitted in that class. I chose not to go to the University of Florida. I chose rather to attend a small Christian college in California. What this reflects is that my choice was a personal choice, a choice informed by the principles, the commitments, and the opportunities as I understood them that were important to me, so that we can't confuse the agency involved in making personal choices with what we might call the historical necessities of the moment. It was a historical moment for Florida. It was not a historical moment for me when I was admitted into that class in 1962. It was a historical moment for my hometown in Florida, where I grew up, when I returned in 1968 to teach in the newly integrated high school there. That was a personal choice. It was a historical moment for that community, but not for me. For me, it was simply an ephemeral opportunity that allowed me, in an interval where I was not immediately engaged in what was my actual goal, my actual ambition, which was to teach not in K through 12, but in higher education. So that throughout all of the US history, what we are reflecting is that people made personal choices to seek to further their goals and ambitions, informed by the choice for freedom. And this shows up most pertinently in the numerous examples that are reflected in the story of Frederick Douglass tricking his young white playmates in Baltimore to help him learn to read, much along the model of Tom Sawyer, Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, teaching youngsters to paint his fence. that we make personal choices. We have a sense of agency. And that sense of agency is what provides the resourcefulness and the resilience to overcome the limitations on choice that were imposed by slavery. It is for that reason that people in slavery were able to develop goals, ambitions, and yes, skills, which inured to their benefit because they were indeed always full human beings. There is a great danger of lapsing into the presumption that to be a slave is to be deprived entirely of humanity, and therefore to emphasize only the brutality of slavery, only the horrors of slavery, the separation of families, the abuses of women, the wanton slaughter of innocents. Those things all happened, but none of them deprived anyone of fundamental humanity. And many, and indeed I would say most, continued to exercise a sense of agency, whether within slavery or in running away from slavery, giving complete empirical evidence of the choice for freedom as the primary moving force within this society in the United States. And they also, of course, made the choice for the United States. That's what we're describing in Prince Hall, in Benjamin Banneker, in Richard Allen, and we could go on, and ultimately Frederick Douglass. Remember, Douglass had to leave the country for fear of being retaken into slavery. And when his freedom was legally purchased, he immediately returned to resume the battle against slavery. The same story is told of, say, William Wells Brown, whom not enough people talk about, who also ran away and who went to England, whose freedom was purchased, and who returned to re-engage in the struggle, as well as to continue to develop himself personally as an osteopathic physician, for example, in Boston. Now, William Wells Brown is also interesting because he actually is a lineal descendant of a Mayflower Pilgrim. He is a descendant of that same Stephen Hopkins, who I mentioned before. By the chances of life and the things that happened in the experience of slavery, it turned out that he was born to a descendant of that Hopkins. And yet he found himself in Kentucky enslaved. So he, Douglass, and so many others didn't while away their time pining, but they rather were autodidacts. They found ways to teach themselves to read, to engage in the greater society, to advance social, political, and cultural claims. And this is the true story of Black history in the United States. It's the history of the choice of freedom in the United States. So when I participated in Florida with the work group on African American history that was re-establishing for the first time independent standalone course in African American history and preparing the curricula standards and guidelines, I did that primarily because it was for me as a native of the state a matter of great importance to see that it be done as much as possible correctly. And so I responded to a general solicitation for participants to volunteer and volunteered for the task. But what must be understood is that the reason my name would have ended up on that general solicitation that went to many people would have been because I had previously worked as a consultant for the state of Florida in developing curricula guidance modules for their teachers in the importance of civic virtue, citizenship, and secondarily, the significance of the 9th and 10th Amendment. So that I had obviously come to their attention and entered it on their list, which meant that for me, when the work group arose, it was a chance again to make a personal choice, a choice to emphasize the significance of the choice for freedom and to ensure, to the extent that my limited powers permitted, that in the state of Florida, what is called African American history would always be recognized as a component of US history, not as something separate and apart from US history. And I believe this is the story that is transpiring across the entire country, wherever people have taken up this particular mantle. People are trying to make certain, one, that we do not neglect fundamental and important moments in the history of Black people in the United States, and two, that we do not excise Black people from the history of the United States itself, and particularly the history of freedom. I have been amazed, and I'll conclude with this, to see in the last several years how much history I learned as a boy that people no longer learn. And they hardly know the names of the very poets and others after whom their various schools were named. They don't have a great deal of sense of what the Rosenwald schools were, the 5,000 of them that disappeared, of course, in the emergence of separate but equal, joined with public education and segregated schools run by the public instead of by Black people themselves. So I take it to be heartwarming to see in Florida Black churches responding to the new curriculum standards by saying, we're going to teach it ourselves. Because I happen to think there's lots of room for churches to be involved in teaching, not just Black history, but reading and mathematics and all kinds of other things, and to reassume responsibility for the education of their young. And so I say to them, rah, 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 go on, do it, pursue it. But don't pursue it as mere tools of a political establishment, which are using you as they so customarily use the Black church to advance a political agenda. Do it seriously, commit to it, undertake to demonstrate that Black Americans, Americans in general, are totally competent to take responsibility for themselves. This seems to me to be what the moment is about in our rehearsing the teaching of Black history and developing appropriate curriculum standards, standards which will highlight the moments that are exemplary, and standards which will also retell the stories of the people, ordinary people, who lived through those times and retell them in their own words. It is so very important that they speak for themselves and not have someone of a latter day speaking on their behalf from the posture of ideological commitment. So the teaching of African-American history has arrived. Its moment has come. It's a moment to be embraced by those of us who would wish to foster a greater sense of responsibility to the accurate presentation of the history of the United States.
Thank you so much. I'm going to assume I'm not interrupting you. Thank you. And I would then go on to Dr. Jones as the next person to speak.
Yes, thanks, David. And I appreciate the chance to participate in this. I just say by way of complimenting my preceding speaker, I could listen to that man all day. That was great to be a part of this. And so I'll try not to, I think as I look at what I thought I would say today, it really meshes nicely with his words, but from a different context. So just by way of background, I served as South Dakota Secretary of Education from January of 2019 to December of 2020. In December of 2020, I took my current job as State Historian and Director of the State Historical Society. In the summer of 21, a work group began in South Dakota to redo its social studies standards. It was comprised of about 40 people, mostly K-12 educators, some professors and so forth. They took the standards that were done in 2013, revised them, made some edits, added in some aspects about Native American history that were incomplete, I would say. The department then attempted to tweak some things and fix some things. And when that department version became public, there was such a public backlash that the governor directed a do-over. So the summer of 21 and what wound up kind of dragging into the summer of 22, I was, as state historian, I was asked to be on the commission that the governor appointed in the summer of 22. We met, had about 6 meetings and participated to revise the standards completely. One of the aspects that I said I wanted to take the advantage of the do-over to doing in talking with the governor's staffers was that I thought that it was very important that over the past, I don't know, depending on how you count it, 8, 9 decades in so many ways, that skills have overshadowed knowledge, and that specificity about history, geography, politics, and so forth was often buried or left out for a wide variety of reasons, and that I thought that skills followed the content. And so they agreed with that, and not only did they agree with that, but William Morrissey from Hillsdale College won the contract to be the facilitator for the effort. And so when he came with the draft, I was very pleased to see that, that his draft and the things that we had to work from in our deliberations and discussions really were about the specifics of, in my case, what I was focusing on was state history and American history. And that was largely there. So it was a good start to that. In our first session, I think as we kind of digested the draft that Professor Morrissey provided to us, I thought, well, this fits very nicely with the overall direction that we have from the legislature. The statutes are fairly thin when it comes to direction to the Department of Education about what standards mean. And in that thinness, and in a local control state, as many states are, they have a wide variety or a great deal of latitude about how they can determine their curriculum and their books and their teaching materials and their pedagogy and so forth. But there is a state statute that says that in all public and non-public schools located within the state, there shall be given regular courses of instruction in the constitutions of the United States and the state of South Dakota. Such instruction shall not begin later than the opening of 8th grade and shall continue into high school. So that was, and there's largely that formed the basis of the theme of the history standards right there in state statute. We could always go back to whether we thought something was in or out if we could track it directly back to a conversation of how it is implementing or living out the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, either at the federal level or the state level. Also, there's a state statute about character instruction, and it directs that school boards will provide character development instruction, shall be given in all public and non-public and elementary and secondary schools. And I'm quoting here, to impress upon the minds of the students the importance of citizenship, patriotism, honesty, self-discipline, self-respect, sexual abstinence, and the respect for the contributions of minority and ethnic groups to the heritage of South Dakota, regard for the elderly, and respect for authority. That statute was passed in 1997. The previous one that was directing the teaching of the Constitution was originally passed in 1939. So I went back to the legislative history and looked at the 1997 debate. That got a lot of pushback from the education lobby, administrators, school boards, and so forth, really pushed back to do it. The bill was killed on a couple of occasions, but through legislative maneuvers was brought back to life. Passed, I think, by one vote in one chamber, and the governor signed it. So with those two statutes performing a basis of highlighting to the Board of Education standards in our commission about what was to be included, we really we had direction to focus on citizenship, civics, and teaching of the Constitution. And I would just go back to reiterate, and I was going to make this point, but the preceding speaker made it far more eloquently than I could, is that African-American history is, in so many ways, a part and parcel of American history, living out the enactment of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the hoped for assertions, or one might say even claim, by Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers about the Declaration of Independence. Certainly in South Dakota, there are not a lot of African Americans. But in our state, 10 to 12% of the population is comprised of American Indians, which brings along a different history, not one of enslavement, but one of disempowerment with tribal politics, the drama, the wars, and the disappointments, the massacres on both sides of American Indian and European American race relations and so forth. And that is a big part of our state. the most well-known massacre in American history occurred in South Dakota at Wounded Knee in 1890. That often gets talked about. And so when we thought about African American history, and certainly when we thought about American Indian history, and we had that theme that was directed to us in state law about making sure to teach the Constitution, and not just in a one-off in 8th grade with a brief discussion in an hour, but we felt as a commission that it was vital. And certainly we felt that because the legislature is silent on every other subject except these two, that spoke volumes about its importance to the state legislature in 1939, and the ones that have modified that as part of the statute since, and then also in 1997 with teaching of civics and character development, that was very important. So I completely agree with the preceding speaker, and I was pleased to be able to speak to this today about that. And just to add, by way of conclusion, that the guidance that a local control state has to teach the Constitution, which is very clear in our state legislative laws and statutes, was really the bedrock of the themes of what we were teaching, and that we all felt that African American history proves up, to use a pioneer term or a homestead term on the plains, it proves up the experience of all Americans, and that we needed to teach that to our kids. So again, thanks to NAS for putting this presentation together. I've appreciated being part of it.
Thank you so much. So thank you very much. And we're now going to go to our third speaker, Dr. Rowe.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and the two speakers before. I think there's a lot of consensus. I thought I'd actually start with a brief story of history. On September 12th, 1962, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at the request of the New York Civil War Commission at the centennial celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation. In his remarks, King emphasized that the document that started the long process of ridding America of slavery was actually inspired by the core principle of equality embedded in the country's founding document. This is what King said, quote, "The Declaration of Independence proclaimed to a world then organized politically and spiritually around the concept of the inequality of man, that the dignity of human personality was instead inherent in man as a living being. The Emancipation Proclamation was the offspring of the Declaration of Independence. It was a constructive use of the force of law to uproot a social order which sought to separate liberty from a segment of humanity," end quote. What King so eloquently revealed was that slavery, far from being a particular American atrocity, was an accepted, grotesque feature at the center of a world. I'm at my school at Vertex, so that's the bell. What King so eloquently revealed was that slavery, far from being a particular American atrocity, was an accepted, grotesque feature at the center of a world ordered around the normalcy of human bondage. Yet it was America's Enlightenment principles that allowed it to, in King's words, uproot a social order and liberate millions of enslaved people in recognition of their inherent and individual human dignity. I share these words of King on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation because, as the prior two speakers just said, because it serves as a good example of how the teaching of African American history is one and the same with the teaching of American history. The two are intertwined. This is relevant to my story because since 2010, I've been the CEO of a nonprofit network of public charter elementary and middle schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Our faculty had the solemn responsibility to educate more than 2,000 students primarily low-income Black and Hispanic kids, whose parents chose our schools because they wanted their children to develop the skills and habits to become agents of their own uplift and to build a better life. I've now launched a new network, Vertex Partnership Academies, a virtues-based public charter high school in the Bronx, organized around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And similar to parents in low-income communities across the country, many of our parents may have faced racial discrimination and other challenges in their own lives and fear that their children might as well. But they know that a great education can make a huge difference. They do not believe their children are doomed to be shackled by the horrors of America's legacy of slavery. They know that because of America's legacy of Black excellence and resilience in the face of slavery and discrimination, hundreds of doors are now open. And young people of all races have the ability to open their own doors if they're prepared to capitalize on the opportunities at their fingertips. This means teaching the rising generation a full history of this country, warts and all. It means letting them know they live in a good, if not great, country, and one that is not hostile to their dreams. As educators debate how best to teach K-12 students about slavery and more broadly African-American history today, it's important to see the barbaric adoption of slavery in the United States as a dispiriting, but nevertheless common, oppressor versus oppressed element of the human condition worldwide, and to emphasize as uncommon America's post-abolition march towards becoming a multi-ethnic society with an unprecedented combination of size, peacefulness, and prosperity. It is now accepted that America's founders laid out inspiring ideals around life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but also committed the original sin of not allowing all human beings the right to fully live up to those same ideals. Yet despite that inherent contradiction, America has made steady progress dismantling laws that impose the racial hierarchy. Educators today are trying to figure out how to portray slavery in America as an example of state-sanctioned oppression and one that is central to our history. The challenge is to do that effectively while also celebrating how our nation's enduring principles have provided the world an indispensable model of how formerly enslaved people came to regularly produce some of the country's most influential leaders in virtually every facet of American life. In 2020, I was proud to become a senior visiting fellow at the Woodson Center, founded by Bob Woodson in 1981. For nearly 40 years, the Woodson Center has empowered thousands of local leaders across the country to transform the lives of people within their communities by involving those suffering challenges to develop solutions and to achieve their potential. In 2020, the Woodson Center founded 1776 Unites, led by primarily Black activists, educators, and scholars. 1776 Unites acknowledges, that racial discrimination exists, and when we work towards diminishing it, but we dissent from the contemporary groupthink and rhetoric about race, class, and American history that defames our national heritage, divides our people, and instills helplessness among those who already hold within themselves the grit and resilience to better their lot in life. As a result, I've worked with the Woodson Center, and we have developed a free supplemental curriculum, K-12 lesson plans based on the 10 Woodson principles of competence, integrity, transparency, resilience, witness, innovation, inspiration, agency, access, and grace. The curriculum offers lessons on Black excellence in the face of unimaginable adversity. Among such examples in the curriculum are, as Dr. Allen just spoke about, are units focused on the nearly 5,000 Rosenwald schools built during the Jim Crow era that educated more than 700,000 Black children through 14 Southern states. Other lessons cover Katherine Johnson, the NASA mathematician who helped put men on the moon, Lawrence C. Jones, pioneering educator who built a life-changing school for the poor, Covert, Michigan, the small frontier town that rejected racial segregation. Woodson Center lessons received high marks in a review by the Johns Hopkins University Institute for Educational Policy, and something that we're incredibly proud of. Since 2020, the lessons have been downloaded now more than 120,000 times by educators and parents in all 50 states for use in public, private, charter schools, homeschools, community and church-based programs, adult education courses, prison ministries, and many other settings wherever character formation is happening for children. Each lesson package includes educator-designed presentation decks, discussion activities, assessments, learning standards, and other supporting documents. Our material can be used to supplement history, civics, English, and social emotional learning curricula. A hopeful and upwardly mobile future for Americans of all races must be built on a shared understanding of our past that is accurate and expansive, not falsely embellished and narrowly selective, a serious flaw of the New York Times 1619 Project. Educators must be encouraged to impart a more complete telling of the Black American experience, one that offers an empowering alternative to curricula that emphasizes racial subjugation almost to the exclusion of Black resilience. As King said on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, "If our nation had done nothing more in its whole history than to create just 2 documents, its contribution to civilization would be imperishable. The first of these documents is the Declaration of Independence, and the other is that which we are here to honor tonight, the Emancipation Proclamation. All tyrants, past, present, and future, are powerless to bury the truths in these declarations, no matter how extensive their legions, no matter how vast their power, and no matter how malignant their evil," end quote. Rather than view American history through a lens that emphasizes racial grievance and discourages lower income children of color, the Woodson Center's free high school and K-8 lessons center on compelling stories of Black excellence, inspiring students to take charge of their own futures and find their place in the American story. Those who seek to teach a sanitized version of American history to achieve some false sense of patriotic education do our country and our students a disservice. And ironically, so do those who cherry pick the most egregiously cruel acts to weave together a narrative of a permanent American malignancy of racism. It is through exposing all the truths in these declarations that we can best teach about US slavery and African-American history more broadly in K-12 schools. And as a dividend, perhaps we will also inspire a reverence for liberty and for the American experiment. Thank you.
And thank you so much. I've got a number of things to say quickly. One, there was a question which somebody asked, where do we find these lesson plans? I answered this, 1776unites.org. If people look in the Q&A button under the answered tab, they'll find that.
Yes, and let me mention, we've actually rebranded now. It's just the Woodson Center curricula because we've merged all of this content together. So you can either go to 1776unites.org, or just go to woodsoncenter.org/curriculum. And it's all free of charge, and there's great materials to be downloaded.
And indeed, I have. I also wanted to say, because you were talking about the emphasis on equality in the Declaration of Independence, that I really have to mention to people the existence of Danielle Allen's Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality by the daughter of one of our fine panelists. So just so people know, that book is out there and exists. I might try to put that link into a chat or something. We already have one question, but before we get to that, because frankly, it might imply a certain amount of negativity, I wanted to ask, I guess, a specific substantive question of my own. So I'm thinking about John Woolman and the Quaker abolitionist work, which leads to, in 1776, the same year as the Declaration of Independence, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting abolishes the owning of slavery. You cannot be a member of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Quakers and be a slave owner. Which for me is saying to me that there is an element of the spirit of liberty in the American nation that precedes the American Republic and the constitutional documents. But that then leads to the question, how can we teach it? How do we teach that as part of African American history and American history when it's a part that isn't explicitly related to our constitutional heritage, to the history of the American Republic? That's a question to any and all, and indeed, I hope all. Dr. Allen.
I will want to tackle that because that's at the heart of the work I was doing in Florida. And when we presented the materials this past summer, one of the aspects I emphasized is that dynamic was present before the Declaration of Independence. And if we teach primary source documents, you can't miss it. Right. If you read Stephen Hopkins, not the one I mentioned before, but the governor of Rhode Island, in 1764, you see a public declaration which denounces slavery. And Rhode Island led the way among the states in abolishing slavery. And that's where the Quaker influence was first manifested as well. So that we see a gradual process building even before the Declaration to embed the resentment of slavery with the defense of liberty. And that was never after separated, even though it met challenges in the minds of people from Georgia and South Carolina at the Declaration of the Second Continental Congress and in the Constitutional Convention. Even though it was a difficult road of foot race, as I called it, it was never eliminated. It was embedded so that many of the conversations, the work of John Adams in the period immediately following the Declaration of Independence also ties into that. What we see, the development of the Abolition Society in Philadelphia and subsequently in New York, the one led by John Jay, among others, and Alexander Hamilton, these things were part of an incremental but steady process. And if we teach the primary source documents, we cannot miss it.
I would 100% agree with Dr. Allen. The whole idea is to, as you say, just teach it. When you come across documents like that and you teach it from the perspective of their time, not through our contemporary lens, you see the grappling that was occurring at the time, that there were forces both in favor of slavery and against. And as Dr. Allen said, over a period of time, forces overcame. And I think that's the beauty of history, rather than this very binary or oppressor versus oppressed view, you start to appreciate the incredible complexity and difficulty at the time of what's happening. And so our students have a just much better insight and visibility into how humanity grapples with some of the most complex issues of our time and their time.
Yeah. I would just pile on and say, I think it's Forrest McDonald's book that quotes Jefferson sometimes after later in life, saying that the Declaration of Independence was merely his putting into succinct words what was already commonly held as a truth widely in the colonies at the time. And he was distilling all of that into very brief couple of paragraphs, and then he was on to the particulars against the king. And so that popularity, it's easy to make that point, I think, with students because it's not all springing out of Thomas Jefferson's pen in June and July of 1776 for the first time. It was stuff that was deep in the psyche of the colonists, and certainly others around Europe as well.
Let me add just one more word to that, David. I want to underscore what Ben has said. The late and great historian Pauline Maier, in her book, also underscores this fact of the general dynamic, the harmonizing sentiments of the day to which Jefferson referred. But I also want to add another note, because I don't want us to miss the complexity of this conversation. That's what Ian was talking about. He says we want to teach it all. That yes, we had this building dynamic, we had this tension in the arguments, but we must remember that even though in the law slavery had become race-based, slavery had not been based on an argument for racial inferiority, and there's a difference, you must remember that, had not been based on an argument for racial inferiority until Query 14 in Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. So what we have in Jefferson is a kind of avatar for both sides of the dilemmas that we face, and we have to acknowledge that. He embedded the idea of racial inferiority in our national discussion, and that more than anything else slowed the progression of the abolition dynamic.
David, you're muted.
I beg your pardon. I'd forgotten I was muted. I would like to go to a question from Tretios Jew, which I want to actually modify a little. Dr. Allen, along with churches and other community efforts exercising their agency to promote historical learning, what are your thoughts on the teaching of U.S. history as it is largely undertaken in colleges and universities today, and how it is largely ignored in K-12? I want to modify this because there could be a slightly, one could condemn things that are done wrongly without it being productive. So I'd like to modify that question, if I may, to how can we constructively reform the teaching of U.S. history as it is done in colleges, universities, and indeed K-12? And that's to any and all, but you first.
Well, I can answer that one relatively easily, and I already have when I referred to primary source documents. We fell out of the use and the reference to primary source documents, not only in the teaching, but the writing of American history back in the 1960s and earlier. But we've also seen a resurgence since the era of the celebration of our respective bicentennials. I published works, for example, on George Washington and others, and there's just been a blossoming of returning to primary sources. And what we've discovered, both in the college level and in the high school level, and indeed middle school level, is that students respond powerfully to primary source documents. They tend to be able to get just that degree of distance on the subject that allows them to receive it unfiltered. And if we do that without asking about the sentiments of the teacher or how to preach a doctrine, we will go a long way to reform without being reformist.
Thank you. And someone else?
I would just briefly add that creating the right incentives helps as well. If you look at elementary school curricula, it used to be, prior to 2010, you would have topics like science and social studies 5 days a week. Like, for example, in New York State, when New York State in 2010 essentially removed the annual social studies exam at the end of the year, it's dramatic. You see this slow erosion where social studies in most elementary school curricula went from 5 days a week to then 4, and then 3, and maybe twice a week for 40 to 45 minutes per session. And so because there is a preponderance of focus now on ELA and math, because those are the subjects of most of the standardized tests, which are content agnostic, So this focus of really building knowledge of history has significantly diminished. It's quite revealing if you look at many states in which there is no emphasis on actual demanding a certain body of knowledge in history. And so I think creating the right incentives, developing effective assessments at the end of the year, demanding history, what I think would be a major shift in K-12 that would bring back history taught in a much more comprehensive fashion.
Thank you. And Dr. Jones, do you want to add?
Yeah, I'd just say that I agree with the primary source. Students will respond to that and take it in all kinds of fun and useful ways. My hesitancy, though, with doing it, oftentimes, if you present them.
Oops.
Well, just as he was about to make the contrasting point.
You're back.
I think I'm back. Am I back?
Yes.
Yeah. If you present them a primary source for which they have no way to place that, they're going to get frustrated and confused. So you wind up doing so much introduction that the class time is spent doing that instead of the time kind of shepherding through with them the analysis that a well-prepared instructor can do. So I would agree with Ian that the primary grades then become that all more vital for them to be introduced to the literature, the names, the dates, the places, and so forth, at a time in their life when they're eager to soak up the details and memorize things and learn maps and understand the successions and orders of the president, Washington and Adams, and so on. That, I think, is something that we got a lot of pushback for with our new standards, is that there was so much detail in the elementary grades. But I hope that K-5 in particular will take a look at the standards that we have and the materials from around are being offered by 1776 Unites and so forth, that they'll see those kids can do it, and they'll be much better off if they're spending their ELA time reading something that has to do with history, civics.
Yeah, and meanwhile, building vocabulary, building background knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, I would say that from my experience, I would certainly agree that an experienced teacher is necessary, no matter which approach you're taking, and a teacher who can explain. But what I would also want you to understand is that sometimes it's better for the teacher to explain after the question is asked, rather than to explain before the question arises. Because when the student asks the question, the student is motivated to hear the answer. And I've seen this demonstrated. I extracted from my larger work on George Washington a tiny pamphlet on the 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. And I've had this taught all across the country to very young children. And what's wonderful about it is they find immense humor in it. It leads to questions, and it gives teachers a chance to explain. So if we wanted to talk about citizenship and civic virtue and the cardinal virtues, here's an easy way to open that conversation by putting that primary source in their hands, letting them ask the question, and then allowing the teacher to develop it.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question from William Mahan, which may indeed overlap somewhat with Tretiastu's previous question. When teaching both Black history and contemporary African-American pop culture, what are some ways to push back against the 20th century's attempt to appropriate both in the service of now defunct collectivist/authoritarian politics?
I wish there were an easy answer to that question, but there is not. And the reason is this. So long as we understand that what's going on in contemporary politics has nothing to do with history, then we'll understand that there's no historical response to it. It's a political response because it's politics. And so we have to remind people that when you're involved with politics, you must deal with it politically. It can't be easily bought in. And yes, teaching history properly build some defense against this approach, the exploitative approach that we see in collectivism and other forms of abuse of our story. But the reality is, these people must be resisted in the public space, politically. That is the only place where an answer to them can be effective.
Thank you. Anyone else want to follow up on that?
I can't do better than that.
All right. Okay, so it is going to be a political response. I will go into another question from Tretiosju. Your thoughts on, would it not be a constructive goal and one that reinforces our unity as Americans for our US history to be taught overall under that one umbrella, rather than segmenting it, as is so commonly done now, into disparate specialized courses? Couldn't this be done while being sure to incorporate history of segmented groups responsibly and accurately, as panels so well speak to, into the overall unifying US history courses?
Absolutely. I mean, I think each of the three of us made the point during our comments that there is no distinction between African American history and American U.S. history, and it is curious, the sort of balkanization. It's a self-inflicted wound in some way when we look at our history through the lens of a particular group of people, an artificial construct, when so many of those forces, whether it be slavery or the economy or why people move to certain regions of the country or the other, have to do with forces that are outside that particular dimension that you're speaking of. So yeah, in our school, for example, there is no, we have a U.S. history class, and within that, we're telling the story of everyone, sometimes with a greater emphasis, obviously, on a Native American community, but it's in the context of America. And so we try very much not to create almost, and I think Dr. Allen referred to it, like, almost excising the Black experience from the American experience, because I think that serves to fuel the divisions that we are seeing too often today.
May I add to that? I think it's because this came up in the Florida case, and I want to emphasize something that people often tend to miss. They say if Florida has created African American history standards, they imagine that's to be taught to Black Floridians. No, the African American history standards are for all students in Florida. And the reason they've made a standalone course is because in their judgment, it required additional emphasis, much the way one would place emphasis on Shakespeare in a general course on literature, so that it is not to take it out of the context of US history. In fact, our work group especially paid attention to coordinating completely the teaching of African American history with the US history standards in the state of Florida. That we meant to say that there'd be no space between them. And that's why the standards developed in the way that they did, so that where somebody wants a particular course in African American history, and this is discretionary to school districts, it's not imposed statewide, then they can have that course, and it still articulates with their broader US history course.
Anybody else want to follow? I'm going to welcome more questions from the audience. I'm going to go to another specific question. How do you teach Marcus Garvey? And he's an interesting case, I think, for how you teach African-American history within the context of American history. What's the role of a Marcus Garvey in that? And, and his followers, and everybody who believed that there was something to what he was saying.
Well, if you go to woodsoncenter.org/curriculum, there's an entire unit on Marcus Garvey.
Tell us about it.
No, and to some degree, it is a warts and all presentation of his philosophy, and there's aspects of it that show critiques of his ideology, as well as his support of his ideas around self-determination for the community as he defined it. And it's like much of the Woodson Center curriculum. I'll even use the Tulsa Massacre as another example that, typically people have a certain view in our curriculum. And please, woodsoncenter.org/curriculum, it's free. For the Tulsa Massacre, the first component talks about Tulsa and this enormous wealth that was built in the Black community during Jim Crow's house. How did that occur? How is that possible during this time? So it's really important for young people to understand that part of the story. Then the next segment of the unit talks about the massacre itself, these horrific events and everything that we know so well. And then the third component talks about the rebuilding of Tulsa. And so this idea that tell the entire story, the complete dimension, warts and all, is just so whether it's Marcus Garvey and a lot of information, pros and cons about him, or the Tulsa Massacre, that's, in our view, the best way to present history that's not, as I said in my closing comments, it's neither sanitizing to take everything out, nor is it cherry picking the most negative pieces. It's warts and all, and to try and tell the most complete story.
I was so glad to hear you describe that way you present the Tulsa Massacre. And one of the things we aimed at in the Florida Standards was to remind people that where many of these massacres took place, whether it was Tulsa or Winston-Salem or Atlanta and other places, the idea that these were poor, indigent Black people being brutalized completely distorts the history. These were people who had done well, who were advancing, who were attaining economic and political power, who excited, therefore, this powerful opposition that produced an outbreak of violence. And to see how they produced those advances is more important even than to acknowledge the violence that transpired. And with regard to Marcus Garvey, my approach to him is to teach him as an Afro-Caribbean. I do not teach him as African-American history, and I teach him as a response and reaction to colonialism and the attempt to import the discourse around colonialism into the United States.
Other stuff to follow? All right. I'm actually going to go from that to, sorry, more questions welcome, but African-American culture, the history of it, is that best taught in a history social studies course or in a literature course? And how should that be integrated in? In fact, let us put it, is there a canon of African-American literature which ought to be taught rather than just, stuff from the last 10 or 20 years? And if so, how do you integrate that into either the teaching of literature or the teaching of history?
Well, again, for us at Vertex Partnership Academies, we're developing our canon, the master works of literature, art, music, poetry that have stood the test of time. So it's not an African American canon, it's not a Native American canon, it's what we believe are the best works that we want our students to be exposed to. So it includes Shakespeare and it includes Ralph Ellison, it includes Richard Wright. I mean, it includes Maya Angelou. It just includes the best that have endured, that have stood the test of time. So it's one of the ways that we, again, try not to create these artificial divisions, because once you start to do that, you create this aura. I mean, I know this sounds ridiculous, but it's similar to the NAACP Image Awards. You feel like you've created this category which now seems less than what is a standard of excellence that should permeate, all pieces of work.
It is so interesting when you talk about that subject, because if you read the examples that Ian mentioned, for example, you will discover that their work builds very heavily on the Western tradition. But absolutely, Odyssean or any of a number of other things, they are embedded part and parcel of Western culture. And therefore, you teach it by teaching where it belongs. That's how you teach it, it seems to me. I'm reminded of the theory that's current about the Southern drawl, which says, it's not a problem to understand the Southern drawl. It's just English slowed way down.
Right. It's great. Great.
So All right, so a follow-up question then. So African American studies courses in particular, and this is following up on Trediosju's comment, often unite African and African American history, sometimes with African diaspora history. This was indeed been an issue with the Florida and the College Board, since the College Board is adopting that framework. If we are integrating African American history in American history, as I frankly think is a good idea, where and how do we teach African history and African diasporan history? Is that simply integrated into world history, or where do you place that? This is wandering a little bit from the original topic, but I think it's actually worth asking.
Well, we actually addressed that question in the Florida curriculum, and we insisted that it was important to tell the whole backstory of slavery. That was from the point of view of destroying this idea that slavery was unique to North America. And so from that point of view, you have to go back into the history of Africa. You go back as far as Aesop, and you have to talk about Egypt. You have to talk about all the various aspects of that history in order to demonstrate the cultural context out of which the importation of slavery into North America took place. And particularly, and this is the most important aspect of this, it was the commoditizing of the slave trade that paved the way for the shipment of slaves into North America. Slavery had been, of course, there was trading in slaves among Arabs and others in the ancient world, but it had not been so thoroughly commoditized as that had at the point at which the Portuguese arrived off the coast of Africa and others began to purchase and sell and to purchase slaves. So that backstory is critical to show how that opportunity to introduce slavery into North America arose. But it's also true, you teach African history the same way you teach European history. There's a history of peoples, of geography, of geopolitics. Those are straightforward, and there's no reason it can't be done.
Other follow-ups to this?
Again, I would agree with Dr. Allen on that. I think it's concise and clear, as he so often is.
Yes, I would too. I think the complex Mediterranean economies of the Middle Ages, Crusades, and so forth are part and parcel of much of this. And so a world history course or any course that would deal with slavery has got to set that up. And the other side of the coin is, what does freedom mean? And you can start that all the way back to Moses and Egypt and so forth, and do it in different ways that should show how that conversation has transpired over time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think.
Go ahead, Ian.
I was just going to say, I think the underlying challenge for so many of these topics is that when you're looking at these histories, are they being taught through the prism of the time that they were grappling, or through a contemporary lens where there is now kind of this social justice or other kind of interpretation? And that's where the real issue lies, where you're reinterpreting or imposing motivations based on a contemporary political view to people hundreds of years ago, whose context, whose everything, circumstance was completely different. And unless you really grapple with what they were grappling with at the time, that's what I think is the biggest thing people who are teaching history have to really struggle with today. And just be honest that, are they imposing their contemporary view versus actually letting the story tell itself based on a true historical perspective?
Yeah, let me illustrate what Ian's just described with an apothem, which happens to be a true story. It was in the fall, in December of 2000, the Tubman movie came out, I believe. And I was in Colorado visiting at the University of Colorado at the time. And we held a viewing at the cinema with an audience that came and held a seminar following the showing of the film, in which I was leading the discussion. And so I was asked to come to the public radio station the next morning to talk about the discussion that we had in Tubman. And in the period prior to going on the air, as hosts always do, they try to warm up their guests and sort of set the stage for a conversation. My host on this occasion said, well, one of the things we'd like you to do is to give us a sense of how somebody who has had the experience of slavery, who understands the experience of slavery, would understand these events in this particular movie. And I looked at her and I recognized, and I knew at the time that she was Jewish. And I said, "Have you forgotten Egypt?" Because she had said, the rest of us wouldn't know how to think about that. Have you forgotten Egypt? So the broader point, of course, is, look, there are no human beings on this earth who have not descended from slaves. None, whatever. And so there's no reason for us to treat this as a private possession of Black people.
Wow, that's profound. Private possession of Black people, it's powerful.
I am going to go to a new question, if I may. I'm just having fun with these, but contemporary history then, post-1965, which doesn't have, after all, the same problem that we are, talking about stuff we can't remember. How do we teach post, civil rights era African-American history, where one, I know that it's like the history class is likely to peter out some decades before the present anyway, and exhaustion about June 1st. But should we be teaching contemporary history at all? And if we do teach contemporary African-American history, what are the leitmotifs? And I would actually say, and what are the primary source documents we choose for that? To any and all.
Well, I will dare this particular one, I suppose. Let me start by saying I think the present discussion is always a live debate. The older stories, there may be debate about, but the present discussion is always a live debate. And so I think you begin the teaching of that by presenting the debate. You have to show the various productions on either side of that question and invite inquiry about them. There's a great deal of writing going on about what this contemporary post-1965 debate is about, whether the war on poverty worked or failed.
Right.
By some analyses, we can say the war on poverty worked, given the difference between absolute poverty, relative poverty, and all those kinds of things. We have arguments about whether the victim mentality that arose post-1965 was a product of some turning point in the civil rights movement itself, or a product of the continuing legacy of racism. It goes on and on and on. Let's present the debate, show the important writings on both sides of the subject. It seems to me that's the only way that can be approached.
It's a very interesting question, because even if you look at something as straightforward as marriage rates, the non-marital birth rate in the Black community now is 70%, and many sociologists and economists tie a lot of the lack of performance in certain segments of the Black community to a breakdown of the family. But some will say, well, that's due to structural racism, and that's due to contemporary discrimination, until you look back in time and you see that in the early 1900s, among the Black community, we had the highest marriage rates in the country, post Civil War, even during Jim Crow segregation. And it's really not until the 60s, where, by the way, that's when the Moynihan Report was written, and the non-marital birth rate in the Black community at that time was 23.6%. And Moynihan was saying this is a crisis because it had grown so much. And he was calling attention. He was accused of blaming the victim, and now it's 70%, 50, 60 years later. So Dr. Allen is right. Present, it's a similar approach, present warts and all. You can't blindly say, well, the breakdown of the family, or the reason that the Black community is so fractured in some ways is because of structural racism, when we had much more stable families, when we had racism enshrined in law.
Yeah. And
so I think, it's a very good question, actually, is how do you teach contemporary history? Similarly, you got to tell the whole story. And again, not come from the prism where you've already got your predetermined outcome. And so now you're only presenting data that supports your contemporary point of view.
I just add that I'm currently this semester teaching a course on Vietnam, and of course I'm focusing on the decisions that are made during the war. And the White House tapes, particularly Kennedy, Johnson, and of course Nixon, until he shuts them off in 74 or 73, it's a rich course where you hear the debate. And I came across a phone call between Martin Luther King and LBJ. King had been in the press, misquoted, he said, misunderstood in the media, and he wanted to call the president himself and tell him he understood the difficult situation that Johnson faced in being a president during the war and all the choices he had. And you can hear King kind of, I don't know, backpedaling maybe a bit strong, but he's trying to refine and put a fine point on the fact that he supports the president. He's and this was in 65, I think, the very year you mentioned. And Johnson is pretty angry. He's very calm with Reverend King, but so I think I'd just go back to present the facts, as the previous two speakers have said, and you can find the complexity in that one conversation between King and Johnson about the Vietnam War, a rich kind of backpedal of, please don't misunderstand my, as King would say to Johnson, please don't misunderstand how the media is portraying me as wrong. And Johnson, of course, is familiar with being misportrayed. So
let me just reinforce what Ben has said, because I've been looking at some of that. And that was such a critical moment in our history, because LBJ and King had formed a bond, and they were in a partnership. And LBJ felt betrayed by King. And it's so visible. King lost LBJ through indiscretion. It was as simple as that. And that has to be part of the story. And then you ask, why the indiscretion? Because he came to be moved by something other than the very precise focused goal he had been working on. He had enlarged his scope, and he enlarged his scope in such a way that it led him to reflect negatively on the course of the nation and even on the values of the nation in a certain way, which was inconsistent with his earlier expressions. So that this is a critical moment in that 65 period, 65 through 68. You can see a great deal of the effect of King embracing an argument that is the predecessor of today's anti-racism agenda. It's unavoidable. And that's why you want to show it all. You see, people go through changes. You see a relationship destroyed that was highly productive for the country between King and Johnson because of decisions that were being made. These things are just so valuable that they almost deserve a course by themselves.
Get rid of the almost. I'm going to ask one last question, I think, before we get to our wrap up, and that is false assumption of a unity of African-American history query. That is, should there be a sense of regional culture? And I don't mean just by this that, in each state you talk about the local leader of the NAACP in 1962. I mean, is there anything distinctive about Scott Joplin such that he ought to be taught in a Texas course? Something distinctive about Bayard Rustin that he ought to be taught in Pennsylvania? Should African-American history be acknowledging the regional variations, the state by state and local variations of African-American culture, and incorporating that, and should that be incorporated in how we teach African-American history? Assuming infinite time, or at least, moderately extensive classes.
One of the things I've found that's fascinating is among the Civil War vets who wrote the Constitution for the state of South Dakota and who founded many of the institutions in the state, when Reconstruction failed, they were some angry old men. And they said so in their presentations, in speeches, and so forth. And by the 1880s and 1890s, there's some ticked off old soldiers about how Reconstruction failed, and they've really feel betrayed. And I think that's a part of the overall theme of American history. But it's certainly, while there were they probably, many of those guys may have not seen an African American for years by the time the 1890s came around, but they remembered their service and what the point of it all was. And so that's a part of it.
What
Yeah.
Ben says is really vital. I think I said earlier that the ground tone of the United States is freedom. So that means that if it's one country, it's one country turning around that particular ground tone. There's a writer, very, very good writer named Colin Woodard, who has developed the argument that there isn't one America. There is a series of cultures. So the argument you raise is the Woodard argument. But I've responded to Colin that he's misunderstanding something. The fact that there are regional differences doesn't mean there is not a harmonizing principle, a principle of national unity. And that's that ground tone I'm talking about. All those regional differences are penetrated by the commitment to freedom. And that's so important, so that one doesn't want to extract the regions from the larger story of the American ground tone.
Yeah, that Edie Hirsch has written about that. That they're communities and cultures, of course, but there's a through line.
Yeah.
What you're calling the ground tone, and that's the American way. And that is what's probably at greatest risk right now.
Yes.
Is that we're not recognizing we have that shared sense of what it means to be an American.
Thank you. All right, that's, I think, a wonderful place to end the main part of this. So I'm going to go to the ask for the wrap up. Could each of you give a minute just of final thoughts, and I guess reverse order this time, just for fun. Dr. Rowe, may I ask you to go first?
Yes. Well, and let me also say that as much as I'd love to my parents to call me a doctor, I'm not a doctor. I'm just a mister. Thank you for this final opportunity, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. It's been great. Let me close by quoting one of my favorite lines from de Tocqueville in America, and he said, quote, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults," end quote. I've always loved that quote, because it emphasizes the idea, just like my students, that America has within it the tools of self-renewal and self-betterment. And again, in the same way, I want my young people to know that they have the tools of self-renewal and self-betterment within them. And I think if we tie that idea to how America has been on this course of repairing her faults over hundreds of years, that would inspire a certain reverence for our ability to continue to do so for our country as well as for ourselves.
Thank you. Dr. Jones.
Yeah, you can call me Dr. Jones. It harkens to somebody else, but I enjoy the joke from time to time. I guess I would just first off, I appreciate being a part of the conversation. When I was first contacted about this, I said I'm not an expert in that, but I do appreciate the connectivity into American history and the ability to think about history in less political ways, even though we might have to use politics to fight the politics. I agree with the comments that were earlier stated about that, and lament much of what's going on in the history profession about using politics in your history. And I constantly am fighting back with, well, the AASLH, the AHA, these organizations are beset, I think, with politics and the self-righteous notion that they need to do politics in order to do history. And I think they've got it exactly backwards. So I appreciate being a part of this conversation and meeting these two gentlemen.
Thank you. And Professor Allen.
Well, I can only conclude this by telling you that this has been the most wonderful conversation on this topic I have ever participated in or witnessed. And I must thank each and every one of you. I feel greatly inspired by what we've been able to do together. I think that you are doing a work that should have far-reaching influence. And so my final comment is to say, carry on.
Well, thank you so much.
Amen, brother.
Amen. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, I feel almost ashamed to go from that to the last minute business, but I will. So first off, the thank yous. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. To our audience, we do it for you. We can't do it without you. Depend upon your questions. Very grateful to you. For the precise practicalities, just to say again, if you have questions unanswered or which you come up with later, send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'd be delighted to forward your questions to the participants so they can have the option to answer you. And within 24 hours, look at our YouTube channel. You'll be able to see this recorded in perpetuity. I will say, if you liked this, please consider joining the National Association of Scholars if you haven't joined already. We're good folks. We'll use your stuff for, trips to Brazil and so on. No, for highly ethical educational purposes. I want to go to Brazil. That's, I think, the last bits. Thank you all so very much. It's been wonderful. And have a lovely afternoon.
Good
Thank
day to
you.
you.